Questions 21 to 31, let's read the blurb. It says, the passage and accompanying graph are adapted from Marion Wong and Peter Buston's Social Systems in Habitat Specialist Reef Fishes. Don't really know what that means. Key Concepts in Evolutionary Ecology by the American Institute of Biological Sciences. Reproductive suppression, so they're defining this, occurs when some sexually mature members of a species are prevented from breeding. The first 5 lines really just give the background. They introduce this species, Paragobian whatever, is an obligate coral-dwelling goby that resides in one tiny host coral. So we've got a fish living in a coral. Within groups, only the largest male and female breed monogamously with each other, and all other group members are non-breeding subordinate females that are reproductively suppressed. So again, they've defined that already. So this is the background, and then right here they identify their research question. To determine whether resource limitation was the cause of female reproductive suppression, University of Wollongong biologist Marion Y.L. Wong and her colleagues began by identifying 3 key resources that could affect female reproductive success. So first 5 lines are pretty much the background. And then the research question is right over here in lines 7 to 8. And the question is basically like, why does this happen? And they're saying there are 3 key resources that could affect it. So that's kind of like their hypothesis. And from the rest of the passage, it's pretty much organized around these 3 key resources. So let's look at it. First, it says the reproductive success of females may be limited by a shortage of suitable breeding sites with which to successfully rear offspring. So the first limitation in resource is sites. We can write that down. Second, it may be limited by the availability of food resources necessary to produce or feed offspring. And so the second limitation is food. Third, this is in line 19, because parental care is provided by the breeding male, the reproductive success of females could be limited by paternal care if the males can successfully care for the eggs laid only by one female at a time. So that's basically saying the males can't really take care of too many kids at once. So the third one is, they call it paternal care. And now in the next paragraph, we actually get into the experiment. And again, they go pretty much according to those 3 things. So what they do first, line 25, they experimentally removed the existing nest site. And what did they do? Line 27, the pair simply picked another branch and laid their eggs, which suggests that nest sites were not limiting. So the first one, the sites, is not the limiting factor. Next, we're going to talk about food. And it looks like they basically artificially gave them food. Line 31, they were squirting high-protein marine fish pellets into their coral colony. And then they compared clutch sizes in line 35 between the fed and unfed pairs. And line 36, the females that were fed laid significantly larger clutches than those that were unfed, which suggests that food was a limiting factor. So the second one, food, it actually was a limiting factor. And the next part, we'll talk about the last factor, which is paternal care. And this concept was a little bit hard to understand. So if you look at line 43, it says, since P. xanthosomus males provide sole care of the eggs, the size of a clutch at hatching essentially reflects the ability of males to care for their eggs. So I guess that basically means that like the bigger it is, the better the male was able to care for the eggs. So again, they're comparing the fed pairs to the unfed pairs, and the idea is, line 45, if the males in fed pairs did not hatch larger clutches than the males in the unfed pairs, despite the females laying larger clutches in the fed pairs, that would suggest that the males were unable to care for the eggs laid by more than one female under natural circumstances. So basically, if you were to think about this visually, right, you've got this one pair where they were fed a lot, and we already know that the females laid more eggs, right? So this is like more eggs. Then you've got another pair where the females did not lay a lot of eggs. So what they're saying is by the time these guys hatch, if you've had more hatching in the pair that laid a lot of eggs versus the pair that didn't lay a lot of eggs, that would show that the male actually was able to care for it. But if the number was the same, that would suggest that the male was limited and unable to care for the eggs laid by more than one female under natural circumstances. So that's what they're saying in 49 to 51. And so what was the result? Line 51, there was no difference in clutch sizes at hatching between the fed and unfed pairs. So that suggests that the male was probably not able to care for the larger pair. And so they say, line 53, that indicates male parental care is another limiting reproductive resource over which females may compete. So the third one, which was parental care, that actually was limiting. So basically the first one was not limiting, the next two were limiting, and the last paragraph is basically the conclusion. We can just write conclusion. So line 57, it says, it's demonstrated that resource limitation underlies reproductive suppression and female competition. And there's a new insight into mating system theory. And they're also saying, since these experiments, the role of resource limitation has been reported in a social mammal. And they're saying that resource limitation, therefore, could serve as a widespread explanation for reproductive suppression. So one experiment which demonstrated it, and then there's another experiment, I guess, which also showed it. So they're saying, hey, this is possibly a widespread thing. Question 1, the main purpose of the passage is to, so remember that the research question was here in line 7 to determine whether resource limitation was the cause of female reproductive suppression. What did they do? They identified 3 key resources that could affect female reproductive success. They went through each of them in an experiment, and they got their conclusions from that. So the purpose of the question is basically, the purpose of the passage is basically to answer this question, I would say, looking at the 3 key resources. So let's look at the answers. Choice A, discuss the role of paternal care in reproductive suppression. So paternal care was one of the 3 factors, but because it was only one, that probably wouldn't count as the main purpose of the passage. B, examine the link between reproductive suppression in peas and xanthomus gobies and in social mammals. They only mentioned social mammals at the very end. Remember, they said that the fact that they found this link in the fish species also led them to have more conclusions about the social mammals, so definitely not the purpose of the passage. C, provide a cost-benefit analysis of reproductive suppression in peas and xanthomus gobies. So cost-benefit analysis, probably not. I'm not really sure what a cost-benefit analysis would look like, but they don't really talk about, what costs and what benefits happen in this sort of situation. D, investigate factors that contribute to reproductive suppression. So yeah, this is the most general because remember, there were 3 factors. They investigated them. The conclusion was that the first one was not a factor, but the last 2 were. So D is going to be your best choice. Question 22, which choice best describes the overall structure of the passage? So let's look back at our annotations real quick. Notice how we start out with some background information, lines 1 to 5, the research question in lines 5 to 10. They mention the factors in the second paragraph, and the next paragraph talks about the actual experiment with the results for each of the factors. And then the last paragraph talks about the conclusion. So we're going to look for something like that. A, the basis of a study by Wong and her colleagues is introduced. So yeah, that's the reason, the justification. The process of the study and its findings are summarized, and a conclusion explaining the significance, which is the importance of the findings, is put forth. So all that sounds okay to me. Let's see if there's anything better. B, the characteristics of a particular species are described. That's okay. The findings of Wong and her colleagues about that species are provided, and a follow-up study of other species is recommended. So this one is kind of like A, but it's a little bit off. They don't necessarily recommend a follow-up study. They did mention another study that came to light since the first study was published. They definitely don't recommend it. And so B is not going to be it. A is definitely better than B. C, previous research on a topic is summarized. I don't really think they talk about previous research. Current research on the same topic by Wong and her colleagues is discussed. That part's okay. And the implications of their cumulative research are explained. So cumulative research would imply the one that was done by Wang and the previous research. But again, because there's no talk of previous research, C is going to be out. D, a hypothesis by Wang and her colleagues regarding a certain species is offered. That's okay. Findings that challenge the hypothesis are discussed. There was nothing that challenged their hypothesis in terms of findings. And the merits of the findings are considered. So D is definitely the most off, and so A is going to be the best answer. Question 23 and 4, these should be done together. The passage suggests that a factor that most directly influences the rank of an individual adult within a particular group is the... So I actually don't remember this from the passage. It's not something that I was paying attention to. Let's just quickly look over it so we know what we'd be looking for. The ability of the individual to obtain resources, the rank of the parents of the individual, the size of the individual, and the size of the clutch the individual is able to lay. I'm pretty sure it's not D. My guess is it could be like C or A, B. I don't really remember anything about talking about the rank of the parents. But, you know, in our minds, we're thinking of a simplified question. What influences the rank of the individual adult? And it's going to be what? Resources, parents, size, or size of the clutch. But in your mind, you just want to think, what influences the rank? So let's look through the answer choices. Choice A is 1 to 3. Okay, this is choice A. Para, blah, 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 is an obligate coral reef-dwelling goby that resides in just one type of host coral, blah, blah, blah. So nothing in here that talks about what determines the rank. A is out. Choice B, lines 3 to 6. Start here. Within groups, only the largest male and female breed monogamously with each other, and all other group members are non-breeding subordinate females that are reproductively suppressed. So yeah, we do have an indication here that it's the largest male and female. So choice B definitely goes along with choice B up here. So this one is B. We'll put B over here. Let's just check the others. C, 6 to 11, right over here. To determine whether resource limitation was the cause of female reproductive suppression, these guys began by identifying 3 key resources that could affect female reproductive success. So nothing here that tells why one is dominant. Choice D, 18 to 22. Third, because parental care is only provided by the breeding male, the reproductive success of females could be limited by paternal care if the males can successfully care for the eggs laid by only one female. So again, this is just talking about possible limitations of the male. It doesn't say anything about which or why he becomes dominant. So best choices for 23 is B, and 24 is also B because it says the, oh, I wrote that wrong. We said size, right? I was just misreading this. So 23 should be C because it says size, and 24 is lines 3 to 6 where it says the biggest male and female. Question 25, as used in lines 7, 24, and 9, determine most nearly means. Start right over here in line 6. To determine whether resource limitation was the cause of female reproductive suppression, blah, blah, blah. So in this case, determine, in my estimation, means like figure out, right? They're trying to figure out the answer to the question. Next is line 24, to determine whether nest sites were limiting. Again, same usage of determine to figure out. They want some information. And the last one, even though it says line 9, they probably mean line 29. It's probably a typo. So look here, it says to determine whether food was limiting. So again, exact same usage of determine here, which means to figure out. So which one's closest to figure out? It would probably be discover because they don't really have the information. And if you discover it, it means you're figuring out something new. Dictate would be like saying A can dictate B, meaning the circumstances in A can determine the outcome in B. Not really what we're saying here. C, choose, that would imply that there are choices to be chosen from, but here again we said determine is like to figure out because we're just trying to figure out information. So C doesn't work. Predict is probably the closest. Let's look at the sentences again. To predict whether most sites were limiting, to predict whether food was limiting. Again, you know, they're setting up experiments here, so it's not so much that they're trying to predict what the actual reality is. They're really just trying to learn what the reality is. So I think discover is still better than predict in this particular case. 26 and 27 should be done together. Based on the research as presented in the passage, which conclusion can most reasonably be made about the average clutch size of a breeding female? So let's read it quickly. The average clutch size of a breeding female may increase if the number of non-breeding subordinate females in her group increases. I'm not sure about that, because what were the non-breeding subordinate females doing that would help her clutch size increase? So I have no idea. I don't remember anything about that. B, the average clutch size of a breeding female may increase if her breeding partner is replaced with a different male. I feel like that might be true, because remember one of the conclusions was that the males were limited in the amount of, I guess, eggs that they could watch. So presumably if you replace one male with another who had a better ability to do that, maybe. C, the average clutch size of a breeding female may decrease if the natural food supply becomes scarce for a sufficient period of time. So that one definitely works, because remember the second factor was food limitation, and they actually showed in those two cases that where there was less food, the sizes were actually smaller. Choice D, the average clutch size of a breeding female may decrease if the number of suitable nesting sites in her colony decreases. So this one I'm going to say is definitely not the right one, because remember nesting sites as the first factor they said was not a limiting factor, because when they limited one or they took away one site, they just went to another. So A seems kind of weird. I'm really debating between B and C, but C I think we'll find more direct evidence for, just based on what I remember from the passage. All right, so the simple question that we're formulating in our head is, what would cause the clutch size to increase or decrease? And then we're looking for evidence. So lines 26 to 28. Start here. In all cases of removal, the pair simply picked up another branch and laid their eggs, which suggests that nest sites were not limiting. So again, this was the conclusion from the first factor. This line here actually disproves choice D. So if I were to say, A down here goes with D, but to actually disprove it, so definitely not A. Next one, 29 to 32. To determine whether food was limiting, a field experiment was performed in which males and females in natural pairs were fed by squirting high-protein marine fish pellets into the coral colony using a syringe. So this is just talking about the experiment. This doesn't actually show or prove why a female clutch size would increase or decrease. So B is out. C, 35 to 38. As was predicted, the females that were fed laid significantly larger clutches than those that were unfed, which suggests that food was a limiting factor for female reproduction. So yeah, this one does seem to go along with the idea that food is a factor, because hey, the ones that were fed laid more and the ones that were unfed laid less. Choice C down here seems to go with choice C up here, which is that the average clutch size may decrease if the food supply becomes scarce. So C goes with C. This time I got it right, and there goes with there. Let's just check D real quick, 42 to 45. Since P xanthomus males provide sole care of eggs, the size of a clutch hatching essentially reflects the ability of males to care for their eggs. So, I'm thinking actually choice D may go along in sort of an oblique way with choice B, right? So if you were debating, is it like C and C or B and D, I would say C and C is actually more direct evidence, because if you look at choice B up here, it says the average clutch size of a breeding female may increase if her breeding partner is replaced with a different male. I think you can kind of get that from lines 42 to 45, but it's definitely more of a stretch than what's written in 35 to 38, because again, in 42 to 45, they're not saying that, hey, they compare different males. Question 28, as using line 44, reflects most nearly means. So start in line 42. Since P xanthomus males provide sole care of eggs, the size of a clutch at hatching essentially reflects the ability of males to care for their eggs. So what are the important words here? The size reflects the ability, so the size of a clutch reflects the ability of males to care for the egg. So what does that mean? They're basically saying that like the size, I would say, shows or demonstrates the ability of males to care for their egg, or you can say the size correlates, like there's definitely a relationship there, right? The size of the clutch correlates with, but you'd have to add with though, the ability of males to care for their eggs. So we said the size shows, and so the closest word is obviously indicates, like it represents or it shows it. One thing shows another. Let's look at the other one. The size speculates. Speculate actually means to take a guess. So you would never use the word speculate with a subject that can't actually speculate. You'd have to say a human being will speculate. The size repeats the ability of the males. That's kind of awkward. They're not really saying that two things are happening over and over again. The size reverses. Yeah, so they're probably thinking, if you're thinking about literally what can reflect mean, maybe it can mean reverse, but clearly not in this situation. So A is going to be the best answer. 29, the last sentence of the passage serves mainly two. Let's look at it. Start in line 60. Since these experiments, the role of resource limitation has been reported on social or in a social mammal, and those results suggested that resource limitation could serve as a widespread explanation for reproductive suppression and the mating systems of social species in general. So what's going on here? They're really just talking about, I'd say, implications and sort of what's the significance of this study, because they're basically saying this study isn't just isolated to, you know, this species of animals. They're saying they also found this going on in a social mammal, and you know that's outside of that animal group. And so they're kind of speculating that when they say the results suggest that resource limitation could serve as an explanation for reproductive suppression in general, they're saying that, hey, maybe we've found like a general principle that works like in the animal world. So let's see what they have. Choice A, indicate further research questions about reproductive suppression in gobies left unanswered. I'd say if it didn't say in gobies, because you could argue that there are further research questions that are implicated, but not in gobies left unanswered by the experiment. It seems like they answered all the questions they wanted to answer or figure out in that particular species. So A, not likely. Suggests that the conclusions drawn from the experiments in the passage have been corroborated, that means confirmed, by another study, in the mammals, and are likely to apply to many species. So yeah, that seems to work from what we just said. It has those two parts. It was confirmed in the mammal studies, and they're making general speculations. C, provide a definition of mating system theory and show that the findings of the experiments described are consistent with that theory. So I would say what makes this wrong is they didn't provide a definition. If choice C said provide a theory or provide speculation about mating system theory and how the experiments are consistent with that, then maybe, but again, there's nothing really so formally stated. Choice D, detailed studies that the researchers who ran the experiments described in the passage plan to conduct to examine. So there's nothing mentioned about studies that they plan to conduct in the future. So that's definitely off, and so B is the best answer. Question 30, according to the graph, the mean number of eggs laid by unfed females was closest to, so let's look at the graph. Mean egg clutch size laid by females and hatched by males in unfed and fed. So pretty simple graph, number of eggs laid by females, unfed, fed, hatched by males, unfed, fed. So the question is asking the mean number of eggs laid by unfed females. Unfed is in the gray, and that's right over here at about 200. So the answer is going to be D. And question 31, which statement about the mean number of eggs hatched by males is best supported by the graph? So we kind of just have to go through each choice. The mean number of eggs hatched by fed males is 150. So fed males is the dark gray and 150. So yeah, that's right over here. So that's about 150. So A looks like it's going to be the answer. The mean number of eggs hatched by unfed males is 200. Unfed males is right here, so that's definitely not 200. That's about like 130. So if that's at 130, it would have been right. Choice C, the mean number of eggs hatched by fed males exceeds the mean number of eggs laid by unfed females. So fed males compared to unfed females. Fed males right over here compared to unfed females right over here. So the fed males definitely does not exceed the unfed females. Choice D, the mean number of eggs hatched by fed males is equivalent to the number of eggs laid by unfed females. So fed males and unfed females, again, we just looked at it. It's definitely not equivalent because there is a difference. It's like 150 to 200. And so D, not going to be right. And A is the best answer.